Well, we do have to pose one question because we have information coming out now that our beloved backup catcher that we just like me with JD Martinez, it was a certainty he was going to be a part of this team. Gary Sanchez is signed with the Brewers on a 1-year, $7 million deal with a mutual option for his second year. And we do have to ask the question if the Diamondbacks will regret not signing Gary Sanchez there on a 1-year, $7 million deal. That seems like a fairly good value for a guy that could have solved more than one problem for the Arizona Diamondbacks.
Yeah, absolutely. We talked about Gary Sanchez, and I think someone brought it up on a mailbag question one day, and I was like, yeah, I like it. As long as, like, if the Diamondbacks had gotten JD Martinez, Gary Sanchez was probably a little unnecessary at that point. I mean, he still could have been your backup catcher, but you're maybe shooting a little higher there than you need to. But if the Diamondbacks were getting a left-handed designated hitter, which they ultimately wound up doing in Jock Peterson, Gary Sanchez made a lot of sense. He can back up Gabby Moreno, and he can also take some of those DH at bats against lefties, or he could catch against lefties and let Gabby Moreno get some DH at bats. I think it made sense all the way around. He ultimately goes to the Brewers, 1 year, $7 million. There's a mutual option apparently for 2025 in there as well. I think it made a lot of sense for the Diamondbacks, and I'm still very curious to see how that spot shakes out for them.
Yeah.
Like, who's DHing against lefties? What does that ultimately look like? Because right now the options that they have there are not particularly inspiring at the moment.
Well, and the Brewers already have William Contreras at catcher, right? So
why do you have to do that?
I have to say it like Bert. And he's a very good catcher offensively. Like it's kind of at times one of those situations with Gabby Moreno felt like, okay, well, we have our catcher, so we really don't need that good of a backup. But Gabby isn't going to play every single game. Like we said, ideally you would like to see Gabby probably get like close to 40 games off during the season. And that's no just a handful of games. That's a lot of games that in theory you would like to see him not behind the plate. So it would be great to have somebody like Sanchez, who, like I said earlier, solves a couple of different issues for you. When you see the Brewers go after him and have him backing up a guy that slashed 289, 367, 457 last year with a 5.4 FWAR, then you kind of think like, well, again, the Brewers aren't going to have William Contreras start, all 162 games. So, like, you do need that guy. You also have him as that DH option as well with slashing what he did against lefties. So, like, I don't know. There's a lot to like there. The value seems fairly good at $7 million for one season. Like, that does not seem like you're asking too much. And also, like you said, they didn't get JD Martinez. So this guy now completely complements their lineup versus, before it would have been a little bit redundant to have two guys that were probably going to have similar, slash lines, both with the same, strengths.
Yeah, I think like just as a backup catcher, Gary Sanchez, like that's maybe a little overkill. I don't know if he would have been interested in a role like that.
Sure.
Like, oh, I'm going to play 40 games. Great.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, Gary Sanchez hit 267, 304, 680 against lefties last year. If you can get that guy in your lineup against lefties on a pretty much everyday basis, that's really big. I mean, the alternatives that the Diamondbacks have in that spot right now, you're talking about Emmanuel Rivera.
Daniel Rivera, get it right.
You're talking about, Kevin Newman potentially if he makes the team, who did have good numbers against lefties last year, but neither of those guys are, I'm not so sure that Gary Sanchez can have an 1,000 OPS again against lefties this upcoming year, but neither of those guys are on his level, in my opinion, in terms of what you'd expect offensively against lefties. So it would have been a significant improvement. It also, I think you just feel better like in games where Gabby Moreno sits entirely if he's on the bench, and not in there as a DH or anything.
Yeah. That's very
I think
true.
you feel better about Gary Sanchez being, in the lineup still in those games as opposed to a Tucker Barnhart or a Jose Herrera. We saw last year how big, of a disparity there was between Gabby Moreno and Jose Herrera. And as a result of that, how, the Diamondbacks record in games with Gabby Moreno versus games with one of their backup catchers there was an enormous difference there. And I don't know if the difference would be that drastic necessarily going forward, but I think it's important for any team to have a a viable backup catcher, like
Yeah.
not just someone, you know, from AAA you can kind of plug in there, but
Look-
someone who has experience and can hit a little bit. And
Look what happened last year, Jesse.
Yeah.
Look what happened last year. How, like, not only was it incredibly like insightful, or like, you know, just forecasting the potential to have Gabriel Moreno be the player he was last year, just to make that trade and have that done prior to Carson Kelly being injured was like Mike Hazen could see the future. You know what I mean? Like that's a completely different situation, because if they attempt to make a trade like that after Carson Kelly is injured, teams will know that they have the Diamondbacks in a position of being able to take advantage of them a little bit. They're desperate.
Yeah.
They need a catcher at that point. You're not going to get Gabriel Moreno and Lourdes Gurriel Jr. in a trade.
Yeah, I think that trade was only going to happen in the offseason.
No. But I'm just saying, like, let's say hypothetically Carson Kelly was injured in the offseason and they knew that they would needed to make a move for a catcher because they weren't going to have Kelly to start the season. Just in general, if the information was out there that the Diamondbacks had lost their starting catcher due to injury and now they're trying to pursue one, it allows other teams to be a little bit more, you know, it allows the Diamondbacks to not be in a real position to negotiate well with other teams. But now, I mean, you know, of course, they're not in a great position if should anything happen to Gabriel Moreno, right? Like now they do need to be thinking about that, because it isn't just a handful of games. It's a lot of games that he could start. And I mean, in this case, Gary Sanchez would have probably been in there in every lineup against lefties. So probably would have been starting, you know, at least just as DH for that purpose alone, close to 30% of the Diamondbacks games right there.
Yeah. I mean, he would have gotten a decent amount of playing time, and there was some question on, at least on my end, going into this for him of like, is Gary Sanchez willing to take a role where he is clearly the backup catcher, and you know, not like I mean, he had a good season last year, all things considered. It was a bit of a roller coaster ride for him. He was on a few different teams, but he wound up being a really big factor on that Padres team. He was Blake Snell's personal catcher.
Yeah.
The guy who won the Cy Young Award, made some enormous strides defensively. His defensive metrics were actually quite good in 2023. So coming off that, I was like, I don't know if Gary Sanchez is, you know, wanting to back up for someone, and it turns out he was okay with that, as long as, you know, in Milwaukee they're in a similar position as the Diamondbacks where they do have some DH opportunity available, and he's gonna be able to contribute there as well.
Castle Freeland with a great point says, thing that bothers me about Sanchez is he has a 304 on base percentage versus left-handed pitching, despite hitting 267, despite have a 680 slugging percentage, right? Like that's crazy. But
I mean, I view that like Gary Sanchez isn't a perfect player. I'm not saying you get Gary Sanchez to hit third against lefties, but you know, you can put up with a 304 on base percentage in the 6 or 7 spot in your lineup.
Yeah.
If that guy is also slugging 700, like that's okay. You're willing to make that trade off.
Well, what does your lineup look like if Gary Sanchez was in there?
Yeah, I think he would probably hit 7th most likely. It would be, you know, it'd be Cattell and Carroll in some order at the top.
Yep.
Gabby Moreno maybe in the 3 hole as he was toward the end last year against lefties. I like that. Christian Walker cleanup, Lourdes Gurriel in the 5 hole. Eugenio Suarez hit 6. That's a pretty formidable top 6 in the lineup against lefties.
Yep.
And then I think it'd be Gary Sanchez in the 7 spot. And yeah, there might be some regression in his performance against lefties. The on-base percentage isn't going to be great, but there's still, in my mind, a big difference between Gary Sanchez and, you know, an Emmanuel Rivera, a Kevin Newman, someone that you don't really know what you're going to get out of, as well as the ability to have him as your backup catcher in general, as opposed to, you know, a Tucker Barnhart or a Jose Herrera, just someone with more experience and more hitting ability. And to Castle Freeland's other point about, you know, the issue of you don't want to take Moreno out of the lineup against lefties in the first place. That wouldn't be part of this at all. Moreno absolutely should be in the lineup against lefties every single day, but you can have one of those guys catch and one of those guys DH. So it would be both of them in there together. In my mind, that's kind of the ideal fit. But we're not going to get that. The Diamondbacks opted not to make that move.
So we're sad. And if we're asking if the Diamondbacks will regret not signing Gary Sanchez, the answer most likely is yes. But hopefully not too much. Hopefully they find some sort of option to back up Moreno. And and maybe it could be an option similar to Sanchez that kind of can fill some of those needs. There's just not a lot of guys available on the free agency market.
After Sanchez, there's not a ton available in terms of backup catchers.
It would need to be through trade. Which
it might be. I wouldn't be surprised if it's Tucker Barnhart or Jose Herrera. Those guys just kind of fighting it out. And we interviewed Tucker Barnhart. He's a great guy who has definitely has an ability to build rapport with pitchers. That's a really important thing too. So if he can get the offense just turned up like a slight notch from where it was last year, he wouldn't be a terrible option in that spot by any means.